one of the things we want to talk about is Christian social justice concerns. I mean, it seems to me that in the Catholic Church, you had a whole move of liberation theology and a big move of social justice, the 70s and the 80s, and it's starting to fade away. But it seems now that it's coming up with evangelicals, and I think it's been around with mainline churches for a while, but especially with evangelicals. And you've been working on that. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a good way of construing it, is that the things that the Catholic Church was dealing with in the 70s and 80s with liberation theology are the main things that the ecumenical movement and some of these mainline denominations have been advocating for and are really dealing with now in the last 2 decades. So that's a good way of framing it. Some of the changes, of course, are that it's no longer just economic issues or sort of economic materialism, but every other oppressed minority that you can possibly think of has their own sort of liberation theology.
So like what?
So there's black liberation theology, there was ecological sort of environmental, and you had somebody like Leonardo Boff, very early on getting into that kind of stuff. But gender liberation, so Rosemary Ruther, Sally McFaig, and these types getting into gender, sexual liberation theology of some sort or another. So I think in the book I call it a theological hydra, because you seem to cut one off, but 2 more pop up, because there's always somebody who's an oppressed minority that can have their own liberation theology to use as a club against the.
Why? It didn't seem to work very well in the Catholic Church. I mean, I'll let you talk about that in a second. But why do you think this is happening?
Yeah. So why is this happening in Protestantism? Well, part of it is they're seeking relevance. Part of it is it's a tool. Part of it is that Protestants in these kinds of groups are about 40 years behind the Catholic Church on a lot of things. Obviously, I mean they're not learning from past mistakes. So the agenda, they're still pushing a sort of obsolete agenda in a lot of ways.
Now, Anielka, you kind of grew up in Nicaragua under liberation theology, as it were. I mean, this was kind of the dominant force. And so when you were going to church, you were saying you went to churches where they had peasant masses and things. I mean, can you kind of talk about your experiences?
Yeah, growing up in our high school, we would have a monthly mass, and at times they would incorporate some of the songs from the peasants' mass. So in these peasant masses, there were a lot of songs that talked about the activities of peasants in nature and a lot of beautiful things. But at the same time, they were portraying an image of Jesus that was not right. They were talking about a Jesus that was a political leader, un guerrillero.
So what do you mean, like armed?
An armed political leader that would fight, that would take up the arms to defend the oppressed. And that is not congruous with the image of a Jesus that came to lay down his life for us, as the king, as the Son of God that came to save us. And the image of a church that really tries to lead us to salvation, that really encompasses more than just a political.
Okay, so how did that experience? The reason I ask this is that the evangelicals are going kind of down a pathway that the Catholics did, right. And Sam will talk about this in a minute. But how did that experience affect, like the life of Christians, life of Catholics in Nicaragua? I mean, did it have a positive experience? I mean, was it a positive effect, or what happened?
It had a lot of negative effects. I mean, it had some positive because of the focus on the poor, you could say. I mean, the church has always been concerned about the poor. But at the same time, it brought about a lot of disunion within the church, because there were people there was this new church for the poor, and then there were the others that were not part of that church. And so in that sense, there was a division between the church. At the same time, there was a lot of focus on doing more than in learning the teachings of the church. So that had an effect in that people left the church or took on other religions because they really didn't get to know Jesus at the time.
Well, it seemed, I mean, that one of the things that Latin America deals with is at least the Catholic Church in Latin America, is that you have big movements of conversion to evangelicals, because that's the first time they've actually heard about Jesus. I mean, instead of hearing like, that guy's oppressing you, they're hearing about Jesus and the message of Jesus. I mean, this seems to be a problem in liberation theology, but at the same time, I mean, doesn't Christ care about the poor? What's the problem?
Sure, Christ cares about the poor, but the poor for the Christian is more than just the materially poor. It's the morally poor, spiritually poor, and in fact, if you look at the scriptures, and you look at the word the poor and the way it's used in in Hebrew and Aramaic, we're all poor, we're all inadequate, we're all in need of salvation, we're all in need of grace, we're all in need of moving towards human flourishing. And that's just one of the problems with liberation theology. It had this radically materialist anthropology of the human person. But we shouldn't be surprised by that, because liberation theology, let's not forget, was never an indigenous Latin American movement. It was created by German-speaking theologians in West German universities in the 1960s.
That's where Boff studied?
That's where Boff studied. It's where people like Gutierrez studied. They went there, they came back, and they started applying Marxist analysis to not just the social situation around them, but they even started applying it to the church themselves. So people like Leonardo Boff, who's, by the way, no longer a priest, has left the church, married a woman. His view was, well, I'm now going to apply Marxist analysis to ecclesiastical structures. And so he had this whole theory about how the bishops and the hierarchy were oppressing the people and the laity and the priests and the priests of the poor. So that whole way of thinking was antithetical to the gospel. And it's not surprising that drove lots of people out of the church, precisely because it said nothing to them about who Christ really was. It was almost like putting a Marxist face on the person of Christ's head and then saying, well, this is who Christ really is. There's other problems with it as well, though, because essentially they marginalize the significance of the divine. God is really an incidental extra to the whole picture of liberation theology in many respects. Other problems include the fact that even their economic analysis, just to get to that subject, turned out to be wrong. And it was ironic, of course, that when liberation theology was quite powerful in some parts of the Catholic Church in Latin America, communism was then falling apart in Central and Eastern Europe. And many of the liberation theologians were asked about this at the time, and they had really no coherent response to what was going on. In fact, when it came to their practical recommendations about what to do, they were usually very vague. But one thing that's very important that Anielka just mentioned, when she was talking about people focused upon doing rather than reflecting, one of the things the liberation theologians talked about was this idea of praxis. You have to act, you have to do things. To which the response of people like John Paul II or then Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger was, yes, action is important, but it has to be informed by correct thought. In other words, orthodoxy, which means right thought, has to inform orthopraxy. Orthopraxis in itself will not give you a coherent reason for doing what it is that you're doing. So theologically, and even just in terms of its own logic, I think liberation theology was always destined to fall apart. And I find it interesting, I've said to Jordan a number of times, that you find a lot of mainline Protestants buying into this now. What's also interesting...
I mean, why is
let
that?
me answer
because
that.
Can I ask a question quickly? Answer that. But also, for some reason, like Christopher Lasch said, that it's the ability of Marxism to speak to the human heart that makes it appealing. So for some reason, it's appealing. I mean, something's bothering them.
Something that resonates.
There's something there, right?
Right.
And so why is it happening? And is there just a disconnect between looking at what happened to the Catholic Church? I mean,
right.
For example, for Catholics, we're like, hey, great. I mean, all those evangelicals who went into evangelicals to find Jesus, maybe they'll come back to the Catholic Church to find Jesus. Since you're I mean, what happened? What's happened?
Well, so there's a couple things going on here. For one thing, the Protestants don't have any structure that can root it out in a way that happened similarly to liberation theology in the Roman Catholic Church. So heterodoxy may or may not be a live category for Protestants, and so you don't have any kind of structures being able to go ahead and sort of normatively say this is out of bounds. In terms of why, really in the last 20 years it's been picked up by the mainline ecumenical movement and other denominations, is because in midst the collapse of communism and the end of the Cold War, these groups were, I believe, looking for something that they could unify around and continue this kind of narrative. So the narrative you'll get is you've got these two empires, right, during the Cold War, the Soviet and the American Empire. One wins, and so now to be prophetic, we need to find a way to fight against this empire, and it's the one that was victorious. And how do we do that? Well, it's in the context of globalization and all these other issues. And liberation theology provides us a means for articulating that critique in a post-Cold War era.
So is it too simplistic to say that a lot of what's happening in evangelicals and mainline Protestant churches is really liberation theology rehashed, or is that, would you nuance that?
Well, I would distinguish first between evangelicals and the mainline ecumenical and denominations. But certainly I believe among mainline ecumenical groups like the Lutheran World Federation, the World Council of Churches, and others, it is not too simplistic to say that it's a version of liberation theology coming to expression. Some people are more explicit about it than others, so you've had people in the leadership of the WCC recently say, yes, it is liberation theology and it's good and we're embracing it, and others I think probably don't really recognize that what they're advocating is a form of liberation theology. And they don't know their recent history, much less the history dating back to the Reformation and beyond.
Sam?